Hello and welcome to another edition of the These Football Times vlog, and once more we are delving into the back catalogue of classic football games with the FA Cup final severely delayed this year in England. We decided to coincide with the upcoming FA Cup final and revisit a classic. As you can see, we have the usual guys here. Gary, welcome from sunny Spain.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, the sun's gone down a bit, so it's a little bit cooler now, but it's been a proper scorch. It's been about 38 degrees here, so I'm welcoming the cool for the evening. And I have a nice glass of good beer, and I'm going to talk about football with my mates.
Brilliant. Stephen, welcome.
All well. How are we doing, Steve?
Yeah, good, thank you. Looks nice and sunny where you are as well, just creeping in there.
Yeah, it's a nice little spot. The sun goes down, and we get this nice little kind of like end of, start of evening glow at this time of year.
Oh, lovely. And Aidan, I really can't tell. Unless that's a small window and you're in Paris. I can't tell where you are.
No, unfortunately, that's not a window into Paris. But no, it's been a lovely day here too. Plenty of sunshine, kids in the back garden. So it's been great.
Excellent. And so today's game was your choice? Indeed,
yes. So looking back through the cup finals of the past, I think... not only was it the right era for me in the 1980s, where I was in sort of being exposed to this kind of thing for the first time, but it was also an era of quite a lot of very good cup finals. So sealing the sort of idea in my memory, and probably yourself and Stephen at least as well, of cup finals being very, very special. They were a big event on television, of course. The whole day around it was absolutely magical and magnificent, but equally the games in that time period seemed to be quite special as well. The one I've gone for was the 1987 final between Coventry and Tottenham, which was, from what I recall at the time and from watching it again now, it doesn't seem to have diminished from reviewing it. It was a very entertaining, exciting game, even if the quality wasn't quite what I might have imagined at the time. It was frantic, it was frenetic, it was non-stop entertainment. So it was one of the great FA Cup finals in an era where there were many very, very good cup finals.
And I suppose that's, obviously I'll come to you first, Stephen, because, the 80s, for us, and I guess we include Aidan as well, those cup finals really from sort of 79 up to probably 88, that sort of decade of FA Cup finals were tremendous.
Sense of occasion. That was what they brought. Was it's an era where live games were still at a premium. They weren't unheard of by then in '87. We probably got about 15, 16 live first division games a season, but it would be maybe 2 or 3 a month. So it still felt like a proper occasion when there was a live game on, and especially a cup final. From Wembley. Wembley was one of those stadiums that, until you visited it in person, it certainly maintained a certain magic. From that long walk from the tunnel to the arc of the stand roof, so it would have that 50p effect in the left hand corner. All of that was just a fantastic thing. The Twin Towers, the Royal Box. It just felt like this was something that footballers had built up their entire career towards, and it was just such a massive day. It was akin to the wedding day almost in football in terms. This wasn't an era where players were blasé about football matches and cup finals. Domestic cup finals mean not very little now, but they're something of a sideshow. They're just an added trinket almost. A cup final now will probably, I think it does, even to fans, probably feels like the Charity Shield used to. It feels like a nice bonus rather than kind of like something that is absolutely massive now. And that's just the way that football has been. It's morphed into something that's the same but different. But yeah, Cup Final Day was always a massive, massive occasion. And it wasn't just Cup Final Day, was it? It was Cup Final Week. There would be a massive build-up to it. There would be previews about players, about managers. You'd always find something different about, you'd find something else about players. This is a pre-internet era, so, there will always be the backstory of a player. I think with this one, You know, we spotted kind of like the build-up was Steve Grisvich's wife giving birth, and she was 9 days overdue. So she was sent in for, you know, to give birth, and he had to break away from the squad and all that kind of thing. It was down to kind of like the injury to Brian Burrows, which was, you know, absolutely massive in the build-up to this game. So there would, you know, this was a proper Classic Cup final, as in not just what happened on the pitch and the fact that you had a surprise winner. It was down to the fact that it just ticked every stereotypical box in that build-up to it. You know, the injured player who missed out on the final, you know, the hero, the unexpected hero, you know, of the hour, you know, even to the unexpected nature of the winning goal. You know, this is probably the most stereotypical FA Cup final of the 1980s, and it delivered in spades.
I mean, Gary, you know, for you, 80 is probably the last, you know, before we get into the game and we get into the era in particular. But, you know, was this the last great era, if you like, of the FA Cup final?
Possibly. I mean, this FA Cup final was particularly significant for me as well, because my son was due to be born not around that sort of time, and my wife had high blood pressure.
You're not Steve Grisvich, are you, Gary?
No. But no, I'm a better goalkeeper. So I remember I had to call the television upstairs because she would watch this. So she was in bed all the time. So we watched the cup final. I was sitting next to her on the bed, and as the game was played out, my son was born 11 days afterwards. But it was a cracking game, and it was sort of, you know, as Stevie said, all the boxes in this game were ticked. Everything you wanted the cup final of this game had, and it was a classic game and very much of its era. And it's amazing. We watched the game yesterday along with so many on Twitter who were following us. The game absolutely skated by. You know, you're sort of looking at your watch, and it was sort of 40 minutes. Where did that go? Where did all that time go? You know, so it's a great game and so much to talk about. So I'm looking forward to chatting about it with the guys.
It is, and obviously, Aidan, you know, as Gary just mentioned there, you know, last night, Saturday evening, at the time of recording, we all sort of watched it in our own homes, wherever that may be. People joining in on Twitter with comments, you know, and Gary's right there. You know, with the game, I mean, I'm not saying I'm not a fan of rewatching games, but it's not something I tend to do a lot of. It sort of frustrates me when you know the ending, but you know, it hadn't, for me certainly, it hadn't lost any of its energy, any of its excitement. You know, like you said before, it was, you know, maybe things were slightly different than how you remember them, but certainly in terms of the whole game being an absolute classic, it did pass by incredibly quickly. That's
right. I mean, if anything, the sort of pace of it and the whole frantic nature of it was more than I remember at the time. It was just endless excitement of so many things going on. And as Stephen says, it's everything you wanted in a cup final, with the own goals, the lead changing hands, the unlikely characters coming to the fore, the huge favourites not delivering and being upstaged by the underdogs. Although there's slightly more to that than may appear at first glance as well. But it was just the perfect ingredients. It was a glorious hot day, as cup finals should always be, of course, and a glorious Saturday afternoon, not evening. Huge crowd at the old Wembley, of course, and watching again some of the comments last night, of course, about the cages around the fans and things like this, and of course how the distance they were away from the goals at the old Wembley behind the goals is huge. Don't know how anyone could see from that position at all, but the atmosphere was extraordinary. There were so many flags in the crowd. The songs coming through, the Coventry, I don't know what the words are, but it was the Eton Boat song tune is their theme. You could hear that coming over loudly throughout, and even when both teams were behind, the atmosphere from their fans as well was still raucous. It was great atmosphere, great occasion, and an absolutely terrific cup final. So it was an easy pick in amongst several other great ones around the time.
I mean, you know, if you think about, so, you know, we're looking, like I say, it's the '87 cup final. Everton are the league winners, and we'll sort of, you know, we'll come to Spurs right now. Spurs were challenging on three fronts going into this cup final. You know, as a season, it was it was very Tottenham-like, really. It was outstanding. It was an outstanding season, and incredibly consistent across, the League Cup and the FA Cup. As Aidan's mentioned there, going into it, it was probably a relatively strong and heavy favourite, bearing in mind who the opposition were, the fact it was their first ever FA Cup final. I think it was the first ever visit to Wembley. But Tottenham that season were actually a very, very good side.
Yeah, they were massive that season. They were well within the title race, I think, up until around about February or March. They were on the brink of the League Cup final. They'd won at Highbury in the first leg of the semi-final. It seemed quite academic that they were going to get through until Arsenal's second leg fight back took the game to a replay. And David Rocastle was just outstanding for them. Seem to remember Martin Hayes having a great game as well. But yeah, that Tottenham side kind of fumbled their place in the League Cup final. They lost the thread somewhat over the course of the spring after Easter in the title race. Everton's own experience there paid off as they kicked in and made off with the title, and then the FA Cup. But yeah, the FA Cup it just seemed to be Tottenham's domain. So many times they'd won it. They'd won it in 81 and 82. They'd won it 3 times in the 60s. They were the FA Cup at that time. If people had a fallback to say, well, the FA Cup, who is the team most synonymous with the FA Cup, and most people would have said Tottenham Hotspur at the time. And they'd had a really good run. They destroyed Watford in the semi-final. They had a bit of luck in that. Watford were down to like the 3rd or 4th choice goalkeeper. I think it was something like the commercial manager's son, Gary Plumley, who played for Newport County in their run to the quarter-final of the Cup Winners' Cup in 81. He'd retired. He was running his own business down in the south of Wales. Tony Coton was injured. Steve Sherwood picked up an injury, and Gary Plumley ended up playing in the semi-final. He was unlucky with the first goal, bounced off him. Straight to, I think, Clive Allen, possibly.
Highly likely that season.
And then like the second one went in by deflection. So, this avalanche of goals just came their way. But it just seemed that Spurs was written on the cup. They'd been really impressive in the quarterfinals. Wimbledon had their own kind of exploratory first run at the FA Cup as such, to go on and win it the following season. They played Spurs in the quarter-final at Plough Lane, and a lot of people thought that Wimbledon would win it, that there was a serious chance of Wimbledon doing them. And because Wimbledon had beaten Everton in the 5th round, who'd been, I suppose, in for the double up until that point, a serious consideration for the double. Liverpool were out, Manchester United were out, Arsenal were out, a lot of the big rivals were out. And then Everton stumbled against Wimbledon, which, because Wimbledon had done that and they picked off some fantastic results in that first season, the first division, it seemed like a real danger, but Tottenham came through it very, very well, and Hoddle and Waddle got a goal each, which kind of was a good nod to them being, yes, they were that horrible kind of stereotypical luxury player, but they could step up and do it, in a hostile environment on a bobbly pitch against a team who just knocked out Everton. So, yeah, Tottenham had absolutely everything going in their favour going into the final, and Clive Allen sat on 48 goals for the season. They were a really fantastic side. And I think the telling thing is that this was a Tottenham side full of internationals, and this was an era whereas now, every squad is full of internationals. Teams in the second and third tier will have countless internationals in them. This was an era where you didn't field your strongest 11 and they'd all be internationals. This was an era where kind of like Steve Bruce couldn't get an England cap. John Lukic couldn't get an England cap. There were some significant footballers who couldn't make it into international football. So for Spurs to be fielding a 13 where the 2 substitutes were internationals was quite a big thing at the time, looking back. And then Coventry, the Coventry side, had one existing international, who was it was Phillips, who would play at right back in place of Burrows, who was a midfielder, but dropped into right back to cover for Burrows. The only other international that Coventry had in their side was Cyril Regis, and he was in the the realm of being a former international. So he was no longer a current international. So this is where this concept that Spurs were big favourites had grown from. That it was a team dripping in international players, load of players with experience of having played at Wembley, players who'd gone to World Cups and won the FA Cup. They had all of the experience, yet Coventry had the momentum. And they were in some fantastic form going into that final.
Coming to Coventry, Gary, and Steve obviously set the scene brilliantly there for sort of one half of this fixture, and as he sort of alluded to towards the end there, you had this cosmopolitan team of internationals. Even Nico Klassen was in there, and then you come to Coventry, and I'm not saying it's the exact opposite. They were in the same division, but it was two incredibly contrasting sides.
It was, and I lived in the West Midlands at the time, and I remember this really well. I mean, I'm sort of obviously I've got a couple of 2 or 3 years older than you guys, and I remember because of the local television, the West Midlands, BBC, and ITV, regional TV, I had a big thing about Coventry and the FA Cup, and John Sillis was one of these larger-than-life characters, and his assistant George Curtis. I remember George Curtis playing for Coventry. Talk about a tough guy. I remember this guy getting his leg broken at, I think it was Manchester United. I might be wrong, but he was stretchered off with a broken leg, his legs strapped together, and he sat up on the stretcher and smiled at the fans and waved as he walked off. Now, this was a tough guy. And John Sillett was also a fairly no-nonsense defender, but very much larger than life. And what John Sillett had imbibed into Coventry was this belief that this was their year. And I don't think there was any particular reason for this. There's no logic to it, but it was just an emotional strength that he'd given to his team. And throughout the weeks before, and as Stevie said, this was the time when Cup final day wasn't a day, it was Cup final week, and even after the semi-finals, it might have been 2 weeks even, and the build-up was massive. And you get kids standing outside Highfield Road with these cardboard cutouts of the FA Cup wrapped in silver foil. They're all classic things, but Coventry really worked on it, and they had this. They had fans going in to watch them, even watch them in training, and the belief was built up. And the old sort of phrase "up for the cup." By God, that team were up for the cup, and massive kudos to Silly for what he did there. A fairly run-of-the-mill team. As Stevie said, the only international player they got was a guy who actually wouldn't have started if everybody had been fit. But they got, and I think this comes out in the game so much. They got this belief, this conviction that it was their year, and they made it happen.
It was. I mean, it's almost. I think someone had put last night. When people were watching it, it was almost, sort of a collective versus individuals is almost how the game sort of played out in the end, with the collective obviously being stronger. But Aidan, I suppose, just to sort of round off the nostalgia and get us into the game, it's John Motson commentating, it's Jimmy Hill co-commentating, and we're listening to last night. We're listening to some of the comments that are made, but again, I suppose that's as part of it. It's of its time, and that's that's how you mentioned the cages and the old Wembley. It is of its time, and that sort of old cliche of hope we get an early goal to and we did. The game kicked off, and it literally kicked off. Sort of in the opening 2 minutes.
Well, it was, we've mentioned the word frantic a number of times, and it was right from the start. High pace, high energy, and for Tottenham to score so early, that could be viewed as justifying all the sort of pre-match press claims of how this was, artisans against artists, and it was the journeyman of Coventry against the great pedigree of the Spurs players. as we were mentioning, so many internationals in that side. I think it was only Mitchell Thomas that wasn't in the whole 13 that Tottenham had on that day. Clive Allen, of course, in clinical form all season. So he scored his 49th goal of the season after only a couple of minutes, which was the same point in the game, more or less, where he got injured a few years earlier in a cup final for QPR against Tottenham. So at a similar point in the game, he's had a rather more positive intervention and scored. It was a nice little bit of play on the wing from Chris Hoddle, I believe, who had an excellent first half. I think he was showing his skills quite well. He had the Coventry fullback in a little bit of bother at times. Nice cross in, but Allen sort of forcing his way ahead of the defender, typical poacher style, I guess, of making sure he was the one going to get to the chance first. And a great header. And at that time, you would think, well, this is basically going as expected, even though, as we've said, the reality is Coventry were the form side, not Tottenham. But as you come to it on the big occasion, the natural inclination is to assume that the team with the greater pedigree is actually the one that's going to do the best, going to be the favourites. And after 2 minutes, they're in front, lo and behold. So surely it's all just going according to plan. It's all going to come true with what everyone thinks is going to happen. But Coventry didn't let Tottenham settle on this lead at all. They harried them, they hassled them, they kept going at them straight away from having gone behind. Their heads didn't drop at all. Perhaps it was so early that there was no time for any of that. They went straight back at them, and within a few minutes they were level. Again, so it's the first sign of the trouble that Houchen would cause, I would think, as he sort of flicked back a header in the box. He gave trouble throughout. I mean, this is a journeyman player. I'm sure we'll come on to him in a little more depth later on, I'm sure. But he's a fairly journeyman player, and this was the high point of his career. But he gave Mabbott and Richard in the Tottenham defence a hell of a time, just with his sheer physicality. So he managed to get a flicked header to a cross on in about the 9th minute or so not long after they'd gone behind. This fell to Dave Bennett in the penalty area. Now he's a guy who will go on to dominate many phases of this game, but at this early stage he was calmness under pressure, lovely control, slight touch to the side, and calmly fired the ball home. And suddenly Coventry are back in it right away. Even at this early stage, it's no less than they deserve, because they've been playing on the front foot, even though they'd gone behind, and they continue to do so, having gone in front, because they had a few more chances in the remainder of the first half. So actually, they unfortunate, I would say, in many ways, to have not gone further, not gone in front at that stage of the game. They were playing very, very well in the first half, but it went slightly different. But there was early signs, definitely, for the trouble they could cause, and they weren't going to let the greater skills or the greater pedigree of Tottenham. This is a Tottenham team who'd never ever lost a cup final, of course, and had won 2 just earlier in the decade. They were never going to let them settle properly, and they certainly never did. It's
funny, Stephen. I'm sort of, Aidan's led us in lovely there with sort of the first 2 goals, and the equaliser coming so quickly, and as we were watching it, there's, like we said, there's comments of the time. Clements, that Liverpool stalwart is in goal for Tottenham, and there's discussion between Motson and Jimmy Hill about whether he would be disappointed with the Coventry goal. Your take on not necessarily Ray Clements in his entire career, but Ray Clements at that time for Tottenham.
Yeah, Ray Clements for me have been the best English goalkeeper for the last 2 seasons. 85, 86. 86, 87, he'd been massively consistent, playing for a good team that was growing into itself, that were moving towards success or hoped for success. And this was kind of like his Indian summer. He was 38 on the brink of 39. And I think he was just enjoying his football more than he had done for quite some time. He'd had a mid-80s dip. He'd struggled at Tottenham in his early days after leaving Liverpool. His debut came in a Charity Shield against Aston Villa, where he was to fault for goals. At least one of the 2 goals that day in a 2-2 draw against Aston Villa. made some high-profile errors, made some errors for England as well. It kind of cost him his place in the '82 World Cup side when it came down to who to pick, whether it was Clements or Shilton for the finals. Clements lost out due to his form there, I think, over the course of '81, '82. He'd been injured, missed the UEFA Cup final in '84. And, it could have, there and then, that could have been a perfect excuse to wind down his career. But he didn't. He came back, fought back, and took his place back in the Tottenham side the following season. And throughout '85, '86 and '86, '87, I don't think there was a better English goalkeeper. If he'd have still been around on the international scene and players were being picked on form, he was in better form over those seasons than Peter Shilton was. And some of the upcoming goalkeepers, I seem to remember talk before the '86 World Cup that Bobby Robson wanted him to go to the World Cup in '86 as backup to Shilton, because in the end it ended up being Gary Bailey and the inexperienced, certainly in international terms, Chris Woods. So he was still highly valued, and I think he was certainly in his best Tottenham form at that point in time.
We've sort of, we've covered the 2 opening goals, Gary, and Clive Allen. We've talked about Clive Allen, that incredible 49-goal season. Player of the Year, Football Writers Player of the Year. But Coventry's goal scorer, Dave Bennett, now he's, I suppose, one of the old, not an old-fashioned winger, but he was what he was. Very good with the ball at his feet, and he was, as Aidan mentioned, he was somebody who thrived on, or to me seemed to thrive on the occasion, on the game. It was almost, sometimes we talked about the old Wembley Stadium and Wembley and the game and the atmosphere and the build-up that week. Sometimes it can almost sort of cripple a player and restrict a player, but he just seemed to thrive on the occasion, thrive on the wide open spaces that Wembley offered him.
Yeah, a big occasion. I mean, you can either make a player or break a player, and this one certainly made a player with Dave Bennett. Now, Dave Bennett was fairly, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't want to sound too derogatory, but ordinary, shall we say, first division player. But sometimes he could be electric, and sometimes he could be somewhat less than electric. But that was his stage, and he took the stage magnificently. And Brazil were playing England on the Tuesday or Wednesday afterwards in what was called the Rouse Cup in those days. And the Brazilian team had been invited to Wembley to watch the FA Cup final. And the Brazilian players could not believe that Dave Bennett was not a regular England international. And on his day, and certainly in the second half and in the extra time period as well, he was electric. It was absolutely electric. Scored that early goal, but he made it was his cross that we'll come to Houchen's goal afterwards. It was his cross that Houchen put in there, but he ran right on that right hand side. And he was the only, Coventry were a no-name side. He was the only name in that no-name side. But as I said, you can make a break-up player on the big stage, and he took to that, and he was probably the man of the match. I would be fairly confident to say he was the man of the match. Some people might say it was. I know Jimmy Hill picked Timber Peak, but Jimmy Hill picked Timber Peak because he used to play for him. And he put to the Plumbing Academy, and that's Jimmy Hill anyway. For me, Dave Bennett was the man of the match. And on the other side, there was Chris Hoddle, who also played really well, especially in the first half. But in the final analysis, I think Bennett had more influence in the game than Hoddle in the end.
It's funny you mentioned about Chris Hoddle there, Gary. Do you think, Wembley, Wembley seems big when you're a kid, and it still seemed big last night when we were watching. The pitch seemed so big. Do you think it's, for winger, for traditional out and out wingers, Wembley must have been a great pitch to play on.
It's really weird because I think I'm correct in saying that Wembley surface is not that much larger than I don't think it's any larger than average first division playing surface, but it just seems that way because the crowd is so far away. So therefore, the size of the pitch becomes magnified. Certainly in the perception, I was watching, I'm sure, in the perception of players as well. And, Waddle played really well. So especially in the first half, he created the goal for Clive Allen. And it was one of the major forces for Tottenham. And it's interesting, we were talking as we were sort of exchanging tweets last evening. Quite a few people said, Waddle hadn't been appreciated. I think it was his second season with Tottenham. And in the first season, he took a lot of stick as these sort of players, not only wide players, but these creative players who are often termed luxury, or shall we say, talented players, seem to take this abuse for some crazy reason in this football that we have this low esteem. We'd much rather celebrate the guy who sort of, runs a lot rather than the guy who creates a lot. And I think Waddle and Glenn Hoddle as well, who also played really well. And God, that guy could find a pass sometimes. Hoddle, look at some of the passes he played, and you think, wow, amazing.
It's. I mean, we'll come to Hoddle. We'll come to Hoddle towards the end. We'll sort of a little chat about him. But yeah, it's interesting. Certainly, both of those, Waddle and Hoddle, both end up going to France. And again, Gary, they both sort of end up almost finding their audience, finding their appreciation, but having to go abroad to find it.
Yeah, absolutely. We have, as I said, we have this problem with talented players, and we were exchanging a couple of tweets with a guy called Matt Owens, who was sort of following the game with us, and we were sort of discussing players, and he mentioned Letizier, there was Frank Worthington, Tony Curry, Peter Osgood, Alan Hudson. Yeah, I mean, you could name 25 without pausing for breath. And English football just doesn't seem to appreciate these sort of players. I think it was Matt who said that he quoted Platini saying if Hoddle had been French, he would have had 150 caps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is why, Aidan, we should be the commentators and co-commentators and pundits for FA Cup finals. However, we'll go back to you, Aidan, and if you can bring us up to half time. It's 1-1. It's very much, like you say, frantic. It's frenetic. To me, the game got stretched within the first sort of 25 minutes. It looked like the last 10. It was such a stretched game so early on.
Talk about the space. I mean, Dave Bennett seemed to have acres of space a lot of the time on the wing. Nobody anywhere near him half the time. So no wonder he played well. But the first half, Coventry, as I said before, had other chances. Houchen caused a bit of a panic for Clements shortly after their equaliser. Cyril Regis had a goal ruled out as well. Mickey Ginn was put through, and he really should have scored. Mickey Ginn's the guy who's got his place in midfield largely through Burrows missing out. I know there'd been a bit of a rejig with Phillips as well into defence, but Mickey Ginn seized his opportunity. He was a bundle of energy throughout. Somebody mentioned last night he has a hell of an engine, and he certainly did. He just never stopped. But also, he should have had a few goals in this game as well. Certainly in this first half, he should have put Coventry in front, but he shot wide. And then, of course, despite Tottenham's elegant play, it was Coventry who'd been causing the panic, but of course it's Tottenham who would go and score. Not long before half-time, it was an awful, awful goal to concede. Grizovic, he'd had one wobbly moment prior to this, not long before, when he'd gone a bit walkabout. The touch of the Rene Higuita's about him. At that time, he'd gone walkabout outside his area, tried to clear it straight to a Tottenham player. The shot was lofted in back over. Unfortunately for him, the defender was back covering, but even then they contrived to give it straight back to a Tottenham attacker, Clive Allen, I think it was, who shot into the side netting from a narrow angle. So Grizovic had the odd little moment, and on this goal shortly before half-time, it was a free kick from the right. It was Hoddle, I think, took the free kick. Grizovic kind of came for it, then hesitated, didn't get anywhere near where it was. But even then, it was a catalogue of errors, really. It's flicked off a couple of people. It was whether it was Goff and then Mabbutt, and then finally I think Kilcline nudged it over the line, but Gary Mabbutt was officially given the goal. I think in those days, we talk about the differences. I think to get an own goal, it has to be something more blatant, like we might see later in this game. when it was not going in at all. Here it was probably on its way in anyway, even though the final touch was Kilcline. I'm sure he was happy to not have that given to him. But yes, so as you say, the first half absolutely flew by. It was barely believable that we were at half-time already at that stage. But Tottenham are in the lead, possibly undeservedly so, in my opinion. Coventry slightly unfortunate, but still showing enough to maintain the belief that they could actually still challenge Tottenham again going forwards in the second half.
It's funny, and I don't know whether you'll be able to answer this or not, Stephen. But can you remember the game the first time around?
Yes.
8-7, and at half time. So at half time, the first, because I remember, obviously, you remember watching it, and you remember, certainly for me, it sort of triggered. Watching it as a kid, Clive Allen's goal and all the goals he's got, and it sort of generated. And I can remember thinking at half time, as I just mentioned there, Tottenham are lucky to be going in at half time yet. But I then fully expected Tottenham to then the second time around, come and kick on and not make the same sort of error they did early in the first half. Is that how you remembered it when you were watching it? Not last night, but
at half time, as they're walking off for half time, I was feeling that Coventry were hard done by. Tottenham were lucky that they got the second goal, and the fact that it was not just that Tottenham had got the second goal, it was the manner of that second goal. And as Aidan said, Motson thought Goff had scored at first, then realised it was Mabbott. But then when you come to look at the replays, it had definitely gone in off Kilcline, and that era was just very much a case of give it to the hero of the goal rather than sometimes the one who gets the last touch. If you go back a year when Liverpool played Everton in the cup final, one of Rush's goals is put over the line by Craig Johnston, bang on the goal line. He actually gets the last touch, but it's credited to Rush, but nowadays that wouldn't happen. And this was, it went. Fortuitous goal. Great ball over by Hoddle. Hoddle struggled throughout this cup final, but this was his, biggest contribution to it, really. It was a perfect ball, but it was bundled over in imperfect circumstances. And when Tottenham walked off with this 2-1 lead, you thought they've got out of jail a little bit here, and they're not going to make a mistake in the second half. But going back to Dave Bennett, he was outstanding in this game, as Waddle was. But there was a lot of incentive in Dave Bennett for this final. He played for City in the 81 final against Spurs and being on the losing side. So there was, not just because it was a cup final, there was just this added incentive to go one better than he had done 6 years earlier.
I suppose, the last sort of, comments on the first half, Gary, in your best punditry way with all the wonderful analogies that you can give. If you had to sort of sum up the first half, obviously, we've talked about an undeserved lead for Tottenham, but could you foresee the end result at half time?
I guess the short answer is no. I'd say I agree with the guys that Tottenham were massive favourites, and sometimes favourites get over the hurdle in an undeserved way. And the goal was damn ugly. For all the talented players had in the park, don't score ugly goals if you can avoid it. But you take what you get in a cup final. But as I said earlier, Coventry were the second best team, but Coventry had by far and away more belief and conviction in their desire and their will to win, and their belief that they were going to win. And I think even though Coventry were behind at half time, I can't imagine that the dressing room would have been downcast, because they played well, they played above themselves. Tottenham had almost stolen the lead. Well, they had stolen the lead. Let's face it, they were the second best team. Had stolen the lead, and I can't imagine Johnson doing anything other than saying, "The better team, go out there and win the damn game," because they were the better team. And for all the skillful players Tottenham had, we're talking, Hoddle, I haven't mentioned our dealers yet. Clive Allen, 49 blooming goals in this season. Jesus. They should have won the league. They should have won the cup, shouldn't they? But, as I say, what Coventry had was something that Tottenham seemed to lack. And to me, as the game went on, and especially in extra time, they had the belief that Tottenham had all seemed to drain away. Once Coventry had scored and equalised, I could only see one team winning it. And I remember the game first time around, as I say, for many reasons. But once Coventry equalised, it just seems, some games you watch, you just think, this is written. What's going to happen? This is written, it's fate. And, Tottenham have won played in 7 FA Cup finals, won them all. Well, they ain't going to last forever, Tiger. Life ain't like that. It doesn't work like that. So I just think that, Coventry might have been down, but they weren't downcast.
I'll just jump in there, is that in a way that early goal that Tottenham got, it kind of did Coventry a favour.
Yeah.
Because they'd gone into it and thought, well, what's the worst that can happen? As you concede an early goal. And that's what Coventry did. They conceded that early goal. But John Sillett will have sent them out there with a plan saying, there's a chance you'll concede an early goal here. And if you do, this is what you do. You just carry on and do all the small things right and get Dave Bennett on the ball. So, I do believe that kind of like the early goal worked in Coventry's favour in the end. It kind of unsettled Tottenham more than it unsettled Coventry.
Yeah, you say it's the worst thing that could have happened, but equalising so quickly is almost the best thing that could have happened, because they said, okay, is that all you've got? Almost, well, we can come back from that.
Yeah,
so,
it asked them the question. You say, well, look, you've given us this early goal to absorb. Here's one back for you, and Tottenham were in, all sorts of disarray for about 10 minutes after that equaliser. Regis had the ball in the net, unfortunate to have that goal disallowed. Clemens had fumbled one under the crossbar. It took Tottenham about 10 minutes to regain the composure after Coventry equalised.
Yeah.
We'll come to you, Aidan, I guess, now you've been the designated match commentator for TFT YouTube channel, as you now are. So second half, feel free to talk us through the second half. I'm sure we'll all have a chat about the highlight, but back to you. Pitch side, Aidan.
I'll try not to talk in Jimmy Hill cliches, but I can't make any promises there. Well, it kind of continued in a similar vein, didn't it? You talked there about how the early goal, Coventry just carried on with the plan of getting it to Dave Bennett and keeping the play going, pushing it wide, stretching Tottenham. And that's what they carried on doing in the second half. So again, they've gone behind, and again, they stick to that plan. They're finding plenty of space. They're still creating and they're still threatening. And Houchen up front is still causing absolute panic every time the ball comes into the box. But it wasn't through a sort of chaotic bit of panic that he got his goal. It was one of the most iconic FA Cup final goals in history. It was voted goal of the season that year, possibly due to a fewer options on live television. I don't know, but still, it was a very, very good goal, and it is one of the most replayed FA Cup final goals that there are. It's one that I'm sure we all tried to replicate in our back gardens that afternoon. Varying degrees of success, possibly not too well, but it was as we mentioned, Dave Bennett, of course, it was a lovely bit of play from him on the right. Nice cross in, curling in. He was in plenty of space yet again. Keith Houchen, it was a flying header. He talked about it afterwards as it being all about instinct. It wasn't that he planned that he'd have to try and head it that way or try and charge a bit further forward or whatever. It was just the ball was slightly in front of him, so he flung himself forwards. Diving header. He was free of his markers, though. He managed to sort of get himself to the cross before any of them could get near him. So flying header, flew into the back of the net. Not much chance for Clements on that one. But it's a remarkable story for Houchen, really, because he's come from virtually nowhere. This is his one moment in the sun, if you like. He'd only scored a couple of goals in the league that season for Coventry, and within a few months of the following season, he was a bit more peripheral again. He'd been at Scunthorpe a year before. He fairly journeyman around various various other lower league clubs, and that's what he would go on to after he went on to Hibs initially, and then a couple of other smaller clubs, beginning and ending his career at Hartlepool. He wasn't a top league player by any stretch of the imagination, except for this brief spell. And even within that, just this brief moment was his biggest moment in the spotlight. But boy, did he take it. He nearly scored another a few minutes later with another header, which Clements got down to with a very good save, in fact, on that occasion. But this again showed how dominant he was in the air in this particular game. They couldn't handle him. It's not as though it's the unexpected, especially not in this era. The big, bulking, powerful centre forward with a good towering header. Now, that wasn't a rarity in those days, and so this must be something that Tottenham's defence, and Mabbutt and Goff in particular, have come up against numerous times. But they really did struggle to handle him on this occasion. And Clements was at times made some good saves, but other times he was unable to deal with it himself as well. Coventry again deserved to get back into it, and again they took the game to Tottenham through much of the rest of the second half. I think really it was only towards the latter stages, when Coventry seemed to tire a bit, that Tottenham threatened to win it and to nick it, and they very nearly did right at the end with Clive Allen. Had a decent chance in the closing minutes, but really the general direction of play was Coventry's again, even though, yes, as you mentioned, the nagging feeling at the time would have been that the bigger team, the stronger pedigree team is going to find the way somehow, by hook or by crook, to win through. And the other major incident to talk about in the remainder of the first half is Brian Kill Klein going in on Gary Mabbutt. Now we talk about the commentators, the co-commentary, Stu. So I absolutely loved this last night with Jimmy Hill. So Kill Klein takes out Gary Mabbutt, almost massing on Caniggia style. Not quite at that pace, obviously, but it was similar kind of area of the body he was going for with a kick. He put his leg across, nowhere near the ball. Jimmy Hill was quite insistent that a yellow card for this would be really disappointing and be a slight scar on the game of a little black mark against it, that he'd possibly give a yellow card for such a foul. And in the end, all he got was a little talking to, but he did get an injury and had to go off. So a little bit of poetic justice, I suppose. But I absolutely loved that in the commentary last night, where Jimmy Hill was so incredulous that he might end up booking him for this hugely cynical, horrendous foul, which today would have got him a red card, no questions asked.
I love it when it's of its time, when it's just of its time, and you have, like you say, you have to wonder what you're going to do to get a booking, and don't spoil the game, ref.
Well, looking back at it, the penny dropped to me earlier this morning over that line. It made me chuckle, but 2 years earlier, Kevin Moran had got sent off in the cup final for Man United. He took Peter Reid, went over the top of him, and he got sent off, and it was a huge thing, first sending off an FA Cup final. And it was this kind of like, oh, it's ruined, the whole order of it all. How can this possibly happen? Even though that Man United still went on to win it. So yeah, this was still fresh in mind as Jimmy Hill is advocating decapitation as a perfectly sound, course of action in a cup final, and it's to go unpunished.
It's funny you mentioned that, actually. I was one of the. I am getting to a point, I promise. One of the sports psychology lessons that I do, we look at Gaza in the cup final of 91, and Roger Milford's refereeing, and the first challenge on Gary Parker that's sort of here, that goes unpunished. Then there's the challenge on Gary Charles as he goes through, and Roger Milford's it being interviewed, it's like a Talking Heads documentary, and he said, because he was injured, he said, my instant reaction was, that's sending off. That is a poor challenge. And it was a poor challenge. He said, but because there was a delay, and he literally said, I've watched it so many times, there's a delay, and then a delay. He said, and then he started to think about the Kevin Moran incident and how much grief the referee got. And so in this documentary, he says that because it looked like Gaza wasn't going to play, he gambled and took a gamble that he wasn't actually going to be able to play, and therefore that would be the justice. So refused to give the red card that he thought he deserved for fear of stick, hoping that Gascoigne wouldn't actually be able to carry on. Never mind that Forrest should have been a man up for the rest of the game. Yeah. But yeah, but again, of its time, he just hoped that Gazza would go off injured, so that he didn't have to deal the death knell for Gazza in the game. Houchen's goal, Gary, I'll sort of come to you. Sometimes, you talk about iconic moments in the FA Cup. Ronnie Radford. No, it's not an FA Cup final, but just sometimes, and again, football, because it's such a dominant sport, but sometimes football can leave. I mean, that moment will outlive Keith Houchen. Not that I wish ill on Keith Houchen if he's watching, but that moment will outlive Keith Houchen.
Yeah, we were talking on Aiden's Today's Football Times recently about the magic of the cup. This was the magic of the cup. This was Dave Bennett on this big stage, strutting his stuff. And this was Keith Houchen, who's, a no-name journeyman striker, scoring a fantastic goal. This is the magic of the cup. And, I can sort of, bear with me for a second. I can sort of appreciate Keith Houchen's goal and the way he played, because I used to play centre forward or goalkeeper. I had about as much pace as a steamroller and about as much grace as well. And but I could do that. I could throw myself at a cross, and it's almost a case where as soon as he made contact with the ball, Clements was beaten. Really, I mean, anywhere unless it hit him, Clements was beaten. Because if you look at the goal again, when Houchen lands, he's about 3 inches away from Clements. Clements. It must have been a horrific sight. This guy hurt and got him, let alone when the ball's going. So it was a fantastic goal. One of the great FA Cup final goals, and it's great that it's scored by a no-name player. One thing I would say though, two things I'd say. First thing I would say about Mitchell Thomas, he must have said, "How much space do you want here, Dave?" Kid, because he stood off him by. I was closer to him. I was back home in Pelsall, so terrible defending. But we just took that Jimmy. We took this one in. When Ardenas got injured in the second half and he was off the pitch, and he rolled off the pitch, and Jimmy Hill said something, words to the effect of, it's a great gesture off the pitch so the game could carry on. And if more players do that, the crowds would come back to football. What?
Yeah, I'm sure that's what Ardenas was thinking.
What? But yeah, a great goal, and a great moment a great FA Cup final moment. And as I said, the magic of the cup. A fairly pedestrian. It was a great game. David had a great game. Player across the ball, and a guy who used to play for Scunthorpe, I think, and then he went around. One glowing moment in your career, but what a moment that was! What a moment!
It was the stereotypical cup final goal of any kid's dreams, wasn't it? To score a diving header like that in an FA Cup final. And yeah, everyone's right there. He was this. It was just a proper kind of comic book moment. His biggest moment beyond that. He'd scored a winning goal in something like third or a fourth round tie for York City against Arsenal. So as far as he was concerned, he'd lived his dream. His big moment was this penalty, this last minute, 89th minute penalty in the depths of winter in a third or fourth round game at Bootham Crescent against Arsenal, 83, 85, 84, something like that it was. But then to go and do this on a beautifully sunny day in May in the cup final, to turn the cup final on its head as well. It was just the most schoolboy's dream, basically.
It's. We'll come back to you in a second, Aidan, to talk us through extra time. But Stephen, do you think that type of goal has died out? There's videos of Andy Gray diving headers that are probably about 6 inches off the floor. Yeah, but do you think the diving header is a type of goal that has almost died out?
Yeah, you certainly don't see it all that often.
I see Neymar scoring one.
It's a much more crowded. Put it that way. Players. Someone on the wing isn't given that amount of space that close to the 18-yard box. Yes, Trent Alexander-Arnold will swing in. A wonderful cross, but it tends to be a lot further back than that Dave Bennett cross. That is far tighter defences now. But yeah, and much more crowded penalty areas. So it tends to be a towering header, or Van Dijk's today was a well directed, just a directed header, basically cushioned header. It's much more refined now. But within that, something has been massively lost from the game in that concept of the stereotypical schoolboys diving header. It's just the FA Cup finals certainly never had a goal like that ever since.
Yeah,
if I can just, it might be true, but one of the reasons why you don't get those goals anymore is you don't get players like what Jimmy Hill would call the big number 9 anymore. I mean, Giroud has been brilliant for us since we restarted the game. He scored something like 7 goals in 9 games, but that's been really unusual. But you look at the top strikers in the top teams, Aguero, Jesus, Salah, Firmino, Mane, Aubameyang. They don't tend to be the big lump up front that they used to be in those days. So
what they also don't have now is the nose isn't all over the face. And most Premier League strikers have their teeth.
They're all far better looking.
And the nose was where it was born. Yeah.
The days of Joe Jordan have gone, Stephen.
Joe Jordan, your Andy Grays, your stereotypical kind of like strikers around that time would be wearing wristbands and a big loss of teeth. Full of scars.
Aidan, we'll come back to you again, pitch side, to talk us through extra time.
Let's go for a job like that. That would be great.
Oh my.
Well, I mean, as a neutral, I want to remember this back then, and it was true again watching it back. As a neutral, you were delighted of another half an hour of this game because the pace was so great, the entertainment, great value. So no complaints at all that this one was going for an extra half an hour. Coventry had seemed a little bit exhausted towards the end of normal time, but slightly revitalised again. Tottenham, of course, they'd had extra time in both of their previous cup final victories, only a few years beforehand. And indeed, quite a number of the recent cup finals have also gone to extra time. So this was nothing unusual at that point. Close, even games going to the wire. This could, of course, have gone to a replay had it remained so. But Tottenham, they had to adjust things slightly. Ardiles, that injury that Gary mentioned when he rolled himself off the pitch for the greater good of the whole of football. He was struggling a bit for fitness. So he was replaced by Gary Stevens, another international on the right-hand side, who brought a bit more energy. But again, the space that Gary Bennett had, sorry, Dave Bennett, I'm going to somebody else there, aren't I? The space that Dave Bennett had on the right-hand side was astonishing to modern eyes. We mentioned it a little bit, but it was even more pronounced, I think, in extra time as people got more and more tired, that he just had the whole area of the field all to himself to just do whatever he liked. But equally on the right-hand side, and it was only after 5 or 6 minutes of extra time, Lloyd Mcgrath got put through on the right, which is what ended up creating the winning goal. Now, Lloyd Mcgrath, he's a guy who's only 22 years old. He was a fairly aggressive, stout, bite-your-legs type of a player. And he'd been speaking about Hoddle in the build-up, because Hoddle, of course, this was his final appearance for Spurs. Something we'll come on to talk about a little bit at the end, I think. But Hoddle had obviously been talking about what a great occasion this would be for his final match, hoping for victory and all of that. But it was well known this was his Tottenham Swanson. Lloyd Mcgrath, of course, was saying, well, I'm going to make sure that he doesn't enjoy that day. I'm going to close him down. I'm going to stop him. And to some extent, he did. This is just this 22-year-old kid who played very, very well. But going forwards, he had his finest moment here in extra time. He got the acres of space on the right as Bennett had moved inside a little bit at this moment. Now, it was a fairly average, or some might say poor, cross into the box. It was nowhere near the strikers. It wasn't really going anywhere. But Gary Mabbutt got himself a little tangled up, trying to block it, clear it, get it away, whatever he was trying to do, and it came off his knee at the perfect angle, of course, to loop over Clements and straight into the net. It's one of those freak moments where you think, well, if it had hit him an inch further lower down his leg or slightly further up on the thigh. It probably wouldn't have looped over in this way. But of course, it hit him where it hit him, and it went in. And this is a proper own goal. Even in the 80s, they couldn't give this to anybody else. Unfortunate for Gary Mabbutt, of course. And they talked at length on the commentary about how he'll be able to claim a goal at both ends, which is an unwanted record. But it was very, very unfortunate for a great player like him. Even Motson was slightly unsure at first. I love this as well. He said, that looked like an own goal to me. Well, how much more blatant do you want it to be? I think that will go down as an own goal. So there we go, 3-2 for Coventry. And again, we talk about classic cup final moments. Yes, we've had the Houchen moment, which was classic in terms of how iconic it was. But for a game like this to be sealed by an own goal adds to the mystique, I think, of cup final folklore. It's quite a moment for a cup final to be won. And of course, through a stalwart player of the team who lost is the one who scored it. That sort of adds to the mythology, I think, around this particular game. It just enhances it slightly. Tottenham then brought Nico Klaassen on up front alongside Clive Allen. Now, Clive Allen tended to work best on his own, really, as a striker. He was a poacher. He liked to be able to find the space himself. Klaassen, he'd been bought in at great expense, but he hadn't really done what they'd hoped of him that year. And indeed, there was a few sort of behind the scenes complaints about wanting to get more action, complaining to Pleat, but Pleat was going to stick with the lineup he had. It had been very successful for him, but Klaassen was a little bit disruptive behind the scenes. But they throw him on towards the end, but I don't think Tottenham really threatened greatly again. I still thought Coventry were the better team in extra time. Towards the end, as the game wore on, they really could have won it more comfortably again. Mickey Jane got through on goal and could have scored. Even Jimmy Hill at one point, again, of course, was missing the point, and as they'd got the ball in the closing minutes on the right-hand side, he was saying, "Oh, well, the pass was to Houchen over there. He really should have played him through." Oh no, they're actually going to keep the ball. Oh yes, of course. What a good idea. Well, of course you will. And Bennett and Regis were perfect at this. They slowed it down. They kept the ball away from Tottenham. They stretched the game out. They pushed Spurs back, and to all intents and purposes, they kept them at arm's length. And those two were the principal players at doing that. And in the latter stages, Spurs really didn't threaten too greatly. A couple of little flurries aside, but Coventry managed to see it out. So, and we talked earlier about it's a victory for the collective over the team of the superior talents, and it certainly was. But I think Bennett in particular, but Regis also in these latter stages, saw the victory out in what now seems a fairly obvious way, but in those days it was possibly a little more intelligent than some would realise.
I mean, for you, Gary, obviously it's the right result, and as you always say, that the best side will always win, because they are the best side, and that's I don't think we can argue with that in this particular game. But it's like I say, it's the FA Cup final is great at throwing out the underdog stories, and Stephen alluded to Wimbledon in '88, but it was almost not preordained, but it just seemed that Coventry, at no point did Coventry think that they would lose, is how it seemed to come across to me.
Absolutely right, mate. There's this sort of, the chant, and now you're going to believe us, we're going to win the cup. Well, when that goal went in, Coventry grew 6 feet and Tottenham shrank 6 feet. Because once that goal went in, the belief that Coventry had carried, that John Slater instilled in them throughout the game, that they exhibited throughout the game when they were down to the early goal and they came straight back. Is that the best you got? Well, we use one back, take that as well. They had that belief, and it was a freakish goal, and the gap between Clemence's hand and the crossbar was just about the width of a football when Mabbutt's knee diverted it over him. Sometimes these things are fated, and Coventry believed that. It was the belief that sort of drilled into them, And as I say, they grew massively after that goal, and there was never a chance of Tottenham coming back. And as I had mentioned, any goals were going to be for Coventry after that, because the game was done and dusted from there.
Aidan's taken us through the game wonderfully well, far better than Jimmy Hill and John Motson ever could. We've sort of mentioned it on and off, throughout this episode. I just want to finish for all three of you really with, a thought and an opinion. I'll come to you first, Stephen, and that's, Glenn Hoddle. Such an enigma in the English game. For me, he's exactly the sort of player I love to watch. I thought he was fantastic, but as Gary said, sometimes it's the physicality that's prized over the creativity in this country. But it was his last game, for Tottenham, last game before he moved abroad. But your thoughts on Glenn Hoddle as a player, and I'll get them from all of you. But if you want to kick us off, Stephen.
Yeah, Hoddle was just a magnificent footballer that was out of step with the English game, in so many ways. Like we said, the comments about how he was received in France and, Platini's take on him. And he was an outstanding player. And, it would have taken a brave step for Bobby Robson to build an England side around him. But it's probably what should have happened. You look at the Ipswich side that Bobby Robson had. He never really translated that to his England side. There was almost like too many options, when he took over the England job. His Ipswich never played with wingers. He had Kevin O'Callaghan, but he never, he would be, he'd be a wild card to throw on as a substitute. He never built a side particularly with wingers. His Ipswich side that chased the treble in 80-81 and come up with the UEFA Cup. They kind of played almost like a diamond. It was like a 4-3-3, but with Eric Gates being withdrawn a little bit. So it was kind of like Mariner and Brazil up front. But then he had this wonderful midfield where it was kind of like Franz Tyson, John Walk and Arnold Buren. So he had all of the players available as an England manager to build, a tribute act to his Ipswich side almost. For Franz Tyson, he had the perfect man there in Glenn Hoddle. But it was this propensity for English football. There would be wingers, so, Chris Waddle being there, the emergence of John Barnes. There were plenty of other options. He'd started the England job and Tony Morley was a huge option. Peter Barnes was still knocking on the door, and England were just a side that played with wingers. And I don't know whether he felt compelled to continue with that. But I think if he'd have gone out there and built England in the image of his Ipswich, Hoddle would have prospered. But as it was, he was in and out. He was often the scapegoat for bad results. And 86 was probably his best shot at glory there. He played. I think he played every game in 86 of the World Cup. And maybe the fact that England went out in the quarterfinals was another, validation as far as English football was concerned, that, Hoddle was that horrible phrase of being a luxury, when it shouldn't have been the case. If you think of the players that he had at his disposal there, he had Glenn Hoddle to be his Franz Tyson, he had Ray Wilkins to be his Arnold Buren, and Brian Robson could have been his John Walk in that respect, but it never seemed to quite happen.
For you, Gary, you mentioned, you rattled off the, sort of the maverick players, if you like, from the 70s, and you're right. There's a long history of almost a suspicion amongst flair players. Do they work hard enough? Can they do it on a Tuesday night in Stoke? And all these sort of old cliches that get thrown out. But ultimately, football is about creativity and inspiration, and and it is those sorts of players that can and should quite often make the difference. But yet, English football, certainly back then, treated them with a fair amount of suspicion.
Yeah, it did, and I don't disagree with anything Stevie said there. Bobby Robson did massively well, getting England as close to winning the World Cup as anybody else has since 1966. But Hoddle to only get the caps he did, travesty. And but he's just one other one on the long list, as you know. I mentioned, even if we forget strikers, forget Frank Worthing, forget Peter Osgood. I'm talking about midfield players, Tony Curry, Alan Hudson. I mean, these players should have had 60, 70, 80 caps, not 6, 7, 8. But English football, as you mentioned, the word used is quite right. English football doesn't trust talented players. And especially in this era, there was this overwhelming requirement that people have to run a long way, run fast, and run hard. And it's not about football. It's not about nobody scores goals by running. Adama Traore might do because he runs very, very quickly. But most players most goals are scored by creativity. And I think players like Hoddle have been wasted by English football so many times throughout the years, and certainly from 70s, 80s, 90s. Even now, you look at players who are talented and great footballers and just don't seem to get the time to be developed because they need the instant success. And talent is a difficult thing to quantify because it can be defined in so many ways. But creativity as talent is probably the best talent in football.
Aidan will, now you're safely back in the studio, we'll sort of come to you at the end. Just to sum up, Glenn Hoddle, for you, where does he sit in that? And it's very difficult, as Gary said, it's always very difficult to quantify these things, but, where does he sit for you in terms of good, great English footballers?
It's frustrating, isn't it? The guys have sort of nailed it of what a sort of wasted opportunity it was to build a team around a talented player like that. That's where it's hard to quantify because we never quite saw what could have been of a team being built around him, which we did see to some extent with the emergence of Gascoigne soon after. It wasn't sort of built around him as such, but he was given enough free rein to show what his talents could do, even though it was for a fairly brief period. Whereas Hoddle was never quite given that opportunity to the same extent. England's system was so sort of fixed and rigid at the time, and it's the trust issue. And I guess the great irony is that when it came to Hoddle as a manager, even though he brought through the likes of Scholes and so on, is that Le Tissier didn't get the same kind of look in. I mean, is Le Tissier on the same level as Hoddle? I don't know. To quite the same extent, but it's similar narrative there, I guess. I think Hoddle, the range of passing, and we talked about that a little bit in this game, even though he was kept quiet for large spells of it, the range of passing he had was elegance. It was just it was seeing things that others couldn't, and it was making things happen where the normal course of events in English football would have seen several phases of play or a bit of rushing around. Instead, a delightful through ball or a ball over the top, because it doesn't mean short passes. It doesn't mean quick tiki-taka. A graceful player can spot a long pass as much as a short one, and Hoddle could do that as well as some delightful goals that he scored. When he came back to English football again later on in time at Swindon and Chelsea, he sort of built sides, and he used the different formation, of course, back three or back five, however you want to talk about, a diamond formation and so on, which freed up the more creative roles, I think, and he brought that into his time at England. But again, it's a shame that Le Tissier didn't quite get the look in that Hoddle himself would have wanted. So yeah, it's hard to position where he sits in terms of the overall scheme of the scheme of English players. He should sit higher than he did in reality. I guess is what I'm driving at. There was the opportunity to build more around him. There was similar issues, I guess, with the likes of John Barnes and Waddle as well, shunted onto the wing, whereas really they could have done with a bit more free rein and creativity, whereas Robson would point out, well, I'm putting in these great talented players. Of course, I'm an attacking manager. I'm not trying to restrict anybody. But, Barnes didn't get to play in the way he did for Liverpool. Waddle didn't get to play in the way he did for Marseille. And similarly, Hoddle didn't get to play in the way he did for Tottenham or Monaco.
It's worth looking if I can, Stu, for just a second. I remember a newspaper headline at the time that said, Hoddle finds God. What a pass that was.
To be fair, he's probably the only one who could. I mean, guys, as always, it's great chatting about football. It was great watching the game last night. It was great to sort of wallow in nostalgia. And again, the opportunity to look back at one of the great FA Cup finals, certainly that I can remember. And obviously to close it off with, a discussion, very articulate discussion as always with you three guys about, Glenn Hoddle and, his sort of legacy on English football. It's been an absolute joy. I'm sure we've run over, but like I say, it's our channel, isn't it? What are people going to do? Take us off air? Yeah, it's been great. Again, thank you so much, and thanks for last night and the sort of 2 hours of reminiscing that I went through. Even if I did have to listen to Jimmy Hill and John Motson, but that's all right. Not all bad. Gary, as always, thanks very much.
Yeah, you can't beat a Sunday evening talking about your mates about football, as I say, with a nice glass of beer. So cheers, guys. That's been great.
Stephen, as always, wonderful to chat.
Yeah, a joy as always, Stu. Another great topic and another great podcast come vlogcast or whatever we want to call this one.
Yeah, whatever it is. Aidan, we'll get this parceled up and sent off to the various broadcasting companies, and we'll see if we can get you some work lined up, ready.
Spot on. That'd be great. Well, it's been really good. It's so enjoyable last night watching it again, and a great cup final. And you should close this out with Chaz and Dave, Stu. That's what you should do. The line 7 times we won the cup, and number 8 is coming up. That didn't quite happen, and if it had happened, this probably wouldn't have been quite as an iconic match as it was.
Brilliant. Well, like I say, thanks ever so much, guys, and we'll look forward to doing it all again soon.
Cheers.
See you later.